What's good everybody, this is CP and welcome back to another fantasy basketball video. Today I'll look at players that could get traded during the 2019-2020 NBA season. Some of these trades could significantly affect the outlook of your fantasy teams down the stretch, so you might want to consider trading or selling high on some of these players. On the other hand, some could potentially be traded to a better fantasy situation, giving them a nice boost to finish off the NBA season, so they might be good trade targets to have on your watch list in the next few months. With that said, let's not waste any more time and 走起吧. Kevin Love is one of the most obvious places to start. So far this season, K-Love has been a dominant fantasy player. Through the first 3 weeks of the season, Love has been hovering around the top 20, averaging close to 20 points and 15 boards a game, along with decent assists, steals, and three-pointers made for a big man. But fantasy-wise, it's hard to say how long Love can sustain these strong numbers, since there's a good chance that he won't last the entire season in Cleveland. The Cavaliers are obviously rebuilding, so it might not be in their best interest to keep a 31-year-old Kevin Love around for the remainder of his contract, which expires in 2023, especially if he continues to produce at such a high level. The Cavs could probably sell high on him and get a nice return. At this point in his career, it's hard to call Love a legit number one option on a contending team. However, many would consider him as an above average second or third option on a legit playoff squad. Possible landing spots for Love could be playoff teams looking to add a proven scoring big man with some presence in the paint. So teams like the Portland Trail Blazers, Utah Jazz, and the Denver Nuggets might be on that list. If he gets traded to Portland, Love's fantasy value will likely take a hit, as he will be playing and sharing the floor with much more talented players in Dame and CJ. At the same time, a player like Hassan Whiteside's fantasy value might drop off as well, especially in games where Portland elects to have Love on the floor for his shooting. In Denver, Love would probably diminish Paul Millsap's role in the rotation. Better yet, if the Nuggets acquire Love, they might try to find a way to move out Millsap's expiring contract. As a result, Millsap's fantasy value might take an even bigger hit. Basically, in any trade scenario where Love gets moved to a better team, his fantasy numbers should fall. I could see him averaging closer to 17 points, 12 rebounds, and 2 triples per game. Overall, Love is probably one of the top sell-high candidates in fantasy basketball early this season. So if you were planning to move him, it might be a good time to do so soon before he gets traded out of Cleveland. Much like Kevin Love, Tristan Thompson is another player that could be traded by the end of this season. Fantasy-wise, he has been one of the biggest early surprises so far. Through the first 3 weeks of the season, he has been a top 40 player and putting up career numbers, averaging a double-double along with a solid field goal percentage and a decent block rate. Thompson has been a must-own player in pretty much all standard leagues, but at the same time, those stats might slowly come back down to earth as the season goes on. Double T is currently in the final year of his contract, and at 28 years old, the Cavs may not have much interest in re-signing him long-term, so in a likely scenario, Cleveland might try to move him before the deadline. And realistically, it seems like the Cavs are using the first part of the season to pump up his trade value. At this point, it is uncertain what the market looks like for Thompson, but I assume that he should be able to draw interest from playoff teams looking for a reliable veteran who can contribute in the paint. Perhaps a team like the Boston Celtics or the Miami Heat might go after Thompson, as they might be looking for an upgrade in the front court. In that case, Thompson could be a huge fantasy threat to players like Enes Kanter and Daniel Tice in Boston. Upon Thompson's arrival, he could be injected into the starting lineup right away. On the other hand, if Thompson lands on a team like Miami, he will likely be given important minutes in the rotation. This may reduce playing time allocated to players like Myers Leonard, Kelly Olynyk, and James Johnson. Overall, it's probably nice to take advantage of Double T's fantasy production right now, but at the same time, he could be a very valuable sell-high candidate who could get you someone with better upside in the second half of the season. Hassan Whiteside is quietly having a nice bounce back year in Portland. It is still very early, but Whiteside looks to be his old self again, averaging a double-double along with a decent field goal percentage and block counts. So far this season, Agent Block has comfortably been a top 100 fantasy player, but it's tough to say if he can give his owners the same value the entire season. If you look at the Portland Trail Blazers depth chart, they're battling with injuries right now and don't have many reliable big men, so naturally Whiteside seems to be their only viable option. but the Blazers expect Jusuf Nurkic to return sometime this season, so it looks like Portland is using Whiteside as a stopgap center to buy them time right now. So once Nurkic returns, it looks like Portland will likely need to address other issues in their lineup, especially the scoring depth at the wing position. As I stated in my last video, Danilo Gallinari of the OKC Thunder might be someone the Blazers target before the trade deadline. If that's the case, Portland might have to move out a contract, and this might make Whiteside expendable. It remains to be seen where he goes, but fantasy-wise, there's a good chance that he won't find himself in a better situation than he is right now in Portland. On the other hand, if Whiteside doesn't get traded, he still might get demoted to the bench and see his minutes cut down. So if Nurkic comes back healthy, I wouldn't be surprised to see Whiteside's fantasy value dwindle down in the final few months of the season. Perhaps it's a good time to sell high on Whiteside soon before Portland decides to make moves in the next few months. Despite being hurt right now, Serge Ibaka of the Toronto Raptors might be another player that gets traded this season, making him a potential good buy low candidate if you have an injury spot open on your roster. Fantasy-wise, his production has been alright so far, averaging close to 25 minutes a game and giving his owners around 15 points, 6.5 rebounds a game and over 1 block. But if the Raptors don't meet expectations in the next few months, Mafuzishev might be moved to address other issues in the lineup. Like many on this list, Ibaka is not young at 30 years old and is in the final year of his contract. In a likely scenario, the Raptors would probably move him before Kyle Lowry or Marc Gasol, especially if they don't plan to resign Ibaka for a few more years. Stats aside, Ibaka is still a very effective two-way player with good presence around the rim, so teams looking to add more depth at center might consider trading for him. Teams like the LA Clippers and the Boston Celtics come to mind. And if he gets traded to either of those teams, his minutes and counting stats might see a small uptick, as he has a chance to see more playing time in the starting rotation. In Standard League, Serge is currently hovering around the top 100 mark, but if he gets traded to either of those teams, there might be a chance for him to break into the top 80 or top 85. Overall, it seems like Ibaka could be one of those players that gets traded regardless of whether the Raptors become buyers or sellers at the deadline. Fantasy-wise, it's probably a good idea to keep an eye on the situation in Toronto, as Serge could be a nice bargain pickup candidate now and be a huge difference maker for your teams during the fantasy playoffs. Lonzo Ball of the New Orleans Pelicans is another interesting fantasy player to watch in the next few months. After making some noise in the offseason with a revamped roster, the Pelicans haven't looked that good so far this season. It is still early, but they might be looking to make moves if they feel like a change is needed. Fantasy-wise, Lonzo Ball has been decent through the first 3 weeks. In standard 12-team leagues, he has been a top 75 fantasy player, averaging over 12 points, 6.5 assists, 1.5 steals, and over 2 triples per game. But we can't forget that the Pelicans are playing without Zion Williamson, and once he returns, Ball's overall fantasy value could take a huge hit. The Pelicans already have a pretty loaded backcourt. They have a starting guard in Drew Holiday, along with players like Josh Hart, JJ Redick, and Frank Jackson all contributing as well. At the same time, Brandon Ingram has been balling out and has been the Pelicans' best fantasy player so far this year. BI looks like he is on his way to a career year, so the Pelicans might continue to expand his role and let him shine in the coming months. Add that to Zion's potential return, there might not be enough playing time and opportunities for Ball to maintain his current numbers. Depending on how things play out, Lonzo could potentially be a valuable trading chip that gets the Pelicans some help in other areas, like the center position. If Lonzo was on the market, it would definitely interest NBA teams looking to add a young starting point guard with nice upside. Young rebuilding teams like the Chicago Bulls, Charlotte Hornets, and the Cleveland Cavaliers might be interested. Perhaps the Cavs and the Pelicans could work out a deal that involves Lonzo going to Cleveland and Kevin Love heading down to New Orleans. Meanwhile, brink playoff teams like the Orlando Magic and the Detroit Pistons look like they could use a player in Lonzo. Fantasy-wise, if Lonzo goes to any of those teams, his value should increase, as he would be given a bigger role in the rotation. At the same time, if Lonzo stays in New Orleans, his fantasy value would likely take a hit when Zion returns. Having Lonzo on your roster might put you in a precarious position. In some ways, he looks like a sell high candidate before Zion returns, but on the other hand, he could have a huge second half if he gets traded to another team. So overall, Lonzo could be a very risky player to own for the whole season. And if you don't want to deal with the potential risk, it might not be a bad idea to trade him for a player with a more certain fantasy outlook in 2020.